Welcome to the TTS Talking Educators podcast. Each week we'll be joined by educational experts from across the globe, offering exclusive insights, inspiration and guidance to help practitioners unlock the potential for learning in educational settings. Hi, my name's Dr. Shaddai Tembo, your host for this week's TTS Talking Educators podcast. I'm a senior lecturer at Bath Spa University, an associate lecturer at the Open University, and an independent writer, speaker and consultant for critical early years. Now, throughout this series, we'll be discussing a range of topics aimed at supporting Oracy in primary and early year settings, inspiring you with guidance and resources to enhance your practice. Today, I'm delighted to introduce Adam Marycz as our guest. Welcome to the podcast, Adam. How are you?
Hi, Shaddai. Nice to catch up. Yeah, I'm good. Thank you. You?
Yeah, I'm really well, thank you. It's good to have you here today. Now, Before we get started, perhaps you could just give a short introduction to yourself for the listeners.
Yeah, of course. Thank you. So as you said, my name is Adam Marycz. I am the early years education consultant at TTS Resources. I've been here just over a year now. Prior to that, I was an early years teacher and nursery manager of nurseries wraparound provision for about 13, 14 years. Opening, closing settings, helping to support educators within those settings. And then aside from that, I've also done some advising and lecturing and consultancy and presented at different exhibitions and conferences and things. And now I'm here.
Great. It's brilliant to have you here today. The focus is, of course, all about Oracy. So let's get straight into it. Perhaps let's consider key terms and what Oracy means. What are we talking about when we say the word Oracy?
So I think it's a really interesting topic to cover, especially from an early years viewpoint, because, some people who are listening to this might not necessarily be familiar with the word Oracy. They may, understand it a little bit more with speaking and listening and communication and language. I think that when in early years, we at times can struggle to potentially understand and adopt some of those words that are used a little bit more in primary and secondary education. I think Oracy is a really good example of that. So when you're talking about Oracy, you're not just talking about the spoken language, you're talking about communication, you're talking about speaking and listening, you're talking about all of that. And I think Voice 21 define it as our ability to communicate effectively using spoken language. It's the ability to speak eloquently and to articulate ideas and thoughts and to influence their views confidently and appropriately. And I think that's a really good place to start, because it is all about speaking and it's all about that ability to communicate effectively and everything that comes with that, the grammar that comes with those sentences, understanding when to pause, understanding back and forth interactions, understanding the emphasis that we put on words. The word that you use, the meaning of it changes fundamentally by where you put the emphasis, and that's a big part of Oracy, and it's a big part of helping children to understand the context behind what they're trying to say. But like I said, I think it's really important that we also understand that it is that listening aspect of things as well. It's that ability to participate in conversation. It's that ability to, learn together, to educate each other, to support each other, to be part of a group situation. All of that plays into helping children to develop their Oracy. I think that, there's so many different ways and strands that we'll explore through this podcast as to how you can understand that. But I think that the way to define it is probably the best way. They're using that speaking and listening idea. And I think when I was thinking about this podcast series, I think my main takeaway was actually when you read in Development Matters and when you read in the early years foundation stage profile, there is no mention of the word Oracy there, and that's in part why I think it can be so challenging, because you could say that to educators and they're like, whoa, what, this is new word, what does this mean? And it can be very confusing, and it, much like when curriculum was brought in and pedagogy were words that we started using a lot more back in 2021 I think it was, that it caused that consternation where people were panicking and believing that they didn't necessarily understand that. And hopefully throughout this these next few episodes, we can help educators to understand that actually it is very simple. It's what you do every day. It is normal practice, for want of a better phrase, and it is not something that you need to be concerned about. And yes, it's something that's used more in primary circles, but that doesn't mean that it's not something that we in early years can, play a really significant role in.
Yeah, I think you're right. It probably is a phrase that is more familiar to primary and secondary school teachers, and the definition that you share from Voice 21 is really useful. We had Amy on the podcast recently, so this is a nice transition on from that. Amy's work was predominantly in schooling context, though, so it's great to have you here from an early years perspective. I think what you were saying about perhaps this being already part of an early years practice is, for me, really important. So what's your sense of the need to talk about Oracy in today's context?
I think we all understand, the importance of communication language, and we all understand that, and we recognise that in recent years, especially, I think it's been, it's come to the forefront of not just what we're seeing in practice, but potentially government policy, and it's become, been brought to the forefront through the pandemic and the different way that children were and were not interacting, and that impact that we've seen on children's development when they're entering our settings is significant. There was the research a few years ago, I think it was quite a while ago, that was with a 30 million word gap between children who were disadvantaged or under-resourced, and those who aren't, and that, but by the age of 5, that they potentially heard 30, there's the 30 million word difference between what they've experienced, and that is significant, and that plays such a huge role in children's outcomes. And, obviously this is about early years, but in their ability to succeed in life, and their ability to gain employment, and their ability to, get the GCSE grades that they want, get the education that they want, and have that contribution to society that we want the next generation to have. And all that we're seeing, I think, at the moment, and this is the fear that, has come from the pandemic, and you read the National Literacy Trust reports recently, all of the things are saying that gap is widening. It's not shrinking. We're not necessarily addressing it in the way that we should, and we can have the conversations which we have all the time about, well, we know that communication, language, speaking and listening, we know that talking to children is the bedrock of everything we do, but are we doing enough? Are we actually having enough of an impact? And how can we do that? And I think, again, there's so many different ways that we can do it, and there's ways that we'll explore as we get a little bit further on in this journey about how, as an educator, you can immediately make those changes. I think, for me, it's that the opportunities that you provide to children to talk, and the way that you support families to understand that, and the impact that can have is enormous. In the pandemic, the huge problem was that children spent a lot of their time not having that interaction, because, as a parent, trying to work at home when you've got your children with you was immensely difficult. It didn't necessarily breed that environment where you could have those one-to-one interactions, which absolutely are fundamental to that. Those formative years, we talk about the 1,001 days, we hear that all the time, and we know how important that is for child development. And, speaking, listening, communication, language, obviously that underpins absolutely everything that we do. So I think it's trying to refine that focus, and we're seeing it in primary, certainly, where there is a big focus on communication, language, and on Oracy, and on supporting children to do that, and there's the additional funding that comes with that. And I think in early years we need to make sure that we are also sort of finite in our focus, and that we're making sure that is the bedrock, and that underpins everything. Like, I find it fascinating, again, like you look at the foundation stage profile, and you look at the development matters, and you look at people's curriculums that they've written themselves, how potentially you've got the prime areas that you've got your communication, language, personal, social, emotion, and physical development, but that communication, language, without that, nothing else will come. So that's got to be the foundation, that's got to be the basis, but we don't necessarily add that emphasis on it that it requires. We sort of treat it like, well, it's one of the 3 prime areas, where actually really it's the bedrock of everything that we do.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. Communication and language and Oracy does significantly underpin all areas of the curriculum, and it's fundamental that we get that right from the start. I think what you were saying there about the word gap and the fact that there's such a level of disadvantage by age 5 is really stark, and really highlights how disadvantage starts quite young in life, but we actually, as educators, have that responsibility to overcome it. So I'm reflecting on, what does an Oracy rich environment look like in the nursery, and how might educators spot that and become more familiar with those opportunities to embed Oracy in everyday conversations with young children?
So it's that ability to talk all the time. It's that ability to, well, in wherever aspect of the environment that is, language-rich environments are so important. And I think, again, like we think about often when people think about language-rich environments, they think about labeling everything. They think about having that, having that written language everywhere, rather than necessarily thinking, well, it's about having spaces for talk. It's about providing as many opportunities as you can for you as an adult and the children to sit down together and to have interactions, those back and forth conversations, those group opportunities, those one-to-one stories. I think back to the environments that, I've built over the years, it was always about making sure that whilst you had loads of opportunities for physical play, and you had loads of space for that, but you also had that space where children could, with the children, or the children on their own could go and just sit and talk, share their experiences, think about what they've done at the weekend, think about how they're feeling now, or whatever that is. It's providing that opportunity there for them. It's having lots of books, it's having lots of stories, and providing the ability for children to engage with them, to create their own stories. Small world is such an important part of that. Children can create their own narratives there, and providing those opportunities for them is what really is what our role is as adults and as educators, is to build that. But then we have to, like we've said before, also remember the importance that we play. Without the adult, an environment isn't language rich. It's not. It can have as many resources in it, and it can have as many areas of learning, and it can have as many things to spark conversations as you want, whether it's based around their interest, whether it's part of your continuous provision, however that might look from an early years viewpoint. But without you as an adult able to scaffold those conversations and facilitate that discussion, and to help, as we said before, to help children to understand the nuances of actual human interaction, it's not got the same purpose. It's not going to have the same impact and achieve the same outcome. And I think, again, it's just understanding that what children from 2, they've got, they say at 2, they've got about 500 words, and by 5 they've got 2,500, and they've got to learn those words somewhere, and that's us introducing that vocabulary, their families, and that's us. That is absolutely our role.
Yeah, it's fascinating what you're saying there, and there's a lot to unpick, and perhaps we won't get to it all in this episode, but I might just respond to you about the role of the adults, because Oracy is a lifelong skill that we all need to develop. But I know some friends that are not good speakers for various reasons. They don't have that confidence. And I guess I'm thinking about how we can support those practitioners who themselves are perhaps not the most outspoken, or perhaps a little bit quieter. How can we support them to model more effective communicational language with young children?
It's about, like you say, it's about confidence. It's about reassuring them. It's about you as a leader modelling that to them and providing them with as many tools and strategies as possible to help that. I think a big thing that I think of is key vocabulary. So if you set up a space and play space any part of your environment, having key vocabulary attached to that, that's obviously key vocabulary for the children, but it's also for your educators. Those key words, if you're doing math, if they're doing accounting thing, then you're adding, subitizing. You've just got that explainer there to help those educators to understand. Because again, subitizing came to my head because I remember when that came in 2021, everyone spent an inordinate period of time concerned about what subitizing meant, and it's about that. That we as adults never stop learning either, and that's the way that we can learn. We can do it ourselves, and we can pass that vocabulary on to the children. I think confidence, being a confident speaker is very, very difficult, isn't it? And when you go and start speaking, I'm much more confident in front of a group of children than I am a group of adults. I'll talk to a group of adults, but it's not as confidently as I would if it was a group of children. And I think it's that self-confidence and you supporting those educators to understand that actually it's okay to be a little bit unsure. It's okay to feel a little bit anxious. It's okay to, feel under pressure, but you know what you're doing, and that everything that you do supports that children's oracy, and every interaction you do does that. And again, maybe it brings us full circle to where we were at the start about this is what the bread and butter that everybody is doing in early years provision day in, day out. And it isn't something that requires a huge, complete overthink. It's what you are always doing when you are supporting those interactions, or when you're supporting children's learning, and when you're actually just engaging with them, you're understanding how they feel, you're sharing your experiences, their experiences. That is all supporting their oracy. It's as basic as that.
Yeah, thanks for that, Adam. I think I'm taking a lot away from this episode about the definition of oracy and the need for educators not to feel anxiety about that term, even though it's perhaps less familiar to them in an early years context, because, as you say, it really is the bedrock and foundation of what we're doing. And what you're saying there about it not necessarily needing to be a significant overhaul, but rather looking for those micro moments in everyday practice to embed more conversations, it feels a really important takeaway. And there's also that idea that oracy, because it is so foundational compared to trends and fads that perhaps come and go in the early years and in schooling contexts more generally, this one needs to stay, doesn't it?
Yeah, absolutely. Like we say, this has got to be the bedrock, and it's got to be everything that we, that we build on. Because as we all know, and I'm sure you'll explore in different aspects of the podcast. As a child, an adult who's got that ability to communicate effectively, whatever that communication looks like, is much more likely to succeed. They're much more likely to be able to read. They're much more likely to, be employed. I was, again, looking at some of the statistics around this, and the statistics are staggering. The lifelong impact that it makes. I'll be completely honest. I didn't realise that the gap, was so large until you start really unpicking it.
Thanks so much, Adam. That's a brilliant place to end this podcast. So, a great episode. Thank you.
No problem. Thank you.
I'd like to say a huge thank you to our guest, Adam, for joining us and providing such valuable insights. You've been listening to the TTS Talking Educators podcast with me, Dr. Shaddai Tembo, and Adam Marycz. If you've been inspired by our conversation today, don't forget you can sign up via the link in our episode notes to be the first to hear about future episodes and access exclusive follow-up content, including ideas for your setting and links to relevant resources.